It began as an ordinary summer day in the quiet English village of Longross. By nightfall, the peace would be shattered forever. Somewhere between midday and sunset, a child vanished. And when she was found, the horror was almost beyond belief. July 18, 1911. 10-year-old Amy Margaret Reeves had been seen playing outside her family's cottage, her laughter carrying across the warm air. Hours later, that same child would be discovered lifeless in a shallow pond just a short walk from home. Her father was the one who found her. Face down in the water, bare feet breaking the surface, her skull fractured by multiple savage blows. Beside her stood a thick wooden stick, driven deep into the mud, like some grim marker left by the killer. This was no accident. This was deliberate, merciless, and unthinkable. In a place where neighbors trusted one another without question, suspicion now pointed toward someone disturbingly close. A teenage boy who had been with Amy earlier that day. But with no modern forensic science to prove guilt, the case would unravel into frustration, rumor, and a verdict that left the murderer free. Longross was not the kind of place where children disappeared. It was a small hamlet where doors stayed unlocked, fields stretched to the horizon, and everyone knew each other's names. Yet here, in this place of supposed safety, the most disturbing truth emerged, that evil can exist in the most familiar of faces. In the next few minutes, we will retrace every step of that day. From Amy's final moments of play, to the desperate search, to the investigation that collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. You will hear the accounts of those who saw her last, the contradictions in the suspect's story, and the chilling gaps that left a community forever divided. More than a century later, this case remains unsolved. But the images, the pond, the stick, the quiet village that learned the cost of misplaced trust, still haunt those who study it. This is the horrifying case of Amy Margaret Reeves, and once you know the truth, you will never look at a quiet village the same way again. Longross in 1911 was a place that could have been frozen in time. A small Surrey hamlet tucked among rolling fields. Its cottages were scattered along winding lanes where the only regular traffic came from farm carts and the occasional horse. Neighbors greeted each other daily, their lives bound together by work, church, and shared history. In a village like this, danger wasn't part of the vocabulary. The Reeves family fit perfectly into this world. They lived in a modest cottage at Kitsum, where the front gate opened to a tidy yard and the scent of flowers from Amy's father's garden. Her father worked as a gardener for one of the local estates, leaving before dawn each morning to tend the grounds before the midday heat. Her mother kept the household running, with Amy often at her side, sweeping floors or helping prepare the day's meals. Amy was 10 years old, with bright eyes and a boundless curiosity about the world beyond her doorstep. She was known for her easy laughter and her habit of wandering between her home and the fields nearby, always waving to neighbors as she passed. In a village where everyone knew her, she was considered safe, protected not just by her parents, but by the entire community. But on the morning of July 18, 1911, this ordinary routine took a subtle turn. At around 11 a.m., Amy was seen in the yard, playing with a local boy, 16-year-old Albert Hampton. Hampton was a familiar figure in Longross. A gardener like her father, he moved between properties for work, often seen carrying tools or idly leaning on a gate to chat. There was nothing unusual about his presence, at least not at first. Around noon, Amy slipped inside to grab a piece of bread and butter before heading back out to play. By 12:30, her mother saw her alone in the yard, the last confirmed sighting before everything changed. Somewhere in the 2 hours that followed, something happened. No one saw it. No one heard it. But when Hampton reappeared shortly after 2 o'clock, walking up the garden path, his behavior was off. Flustered, restless. His explanation for the afternoon, sleeping under an apple tree, would soon be tested and found wanting. The peace of Longross was about to fracture. The familiar faces and quiet lanes would take on a different shape in the days to come. One where every memory of July 18th would be examined, every alibi tested, every friendly neighbor viewed with suspicion. And for Amy's family, the final normal morning they ever knew was already behind them. In the next segment, we step into the moment when the quiet turns to panic, when Amy's absence is no longer a passing concern, but the beginning of a nightmare. It was late afternoon when the unease began, the kind of unease that starts small. A glance at the clock, a check out the window, but quickly swells into dread. When Amy's father returned from work, he expected to see his daughter in the yard or skipping along the lane. She was nowhere. Inside, her mother's voice had already taken on that edge, the one parents get when they're trying to hide worry from themselves. In Longross, children didn't simply disappear. If Amy wasn't at home, she'd be at a neighbor's or exploring the nearby fields. The search began casually, almost confidently, as if she'd come running back at any moment. Neighbors stepped out of their cottages, wiping their hands on aprons, pointing toward paths she might have taken. But the minutes kept passing. The casual search became urgent. Names were called louder now. Voices overlapped. Someone checked the orchard. Another looked near the schoolhouse. Still nothing. By the time the sun began to drop toward the horizon, the search had transformed into a coordinated effort. Lanterns appeared in hands. Boots tramped along dirt tracks. People fanned out across Churchy Common and the surrounding farmland. It was Amy's father who found her. He followed a narrow footpath leading away from the cottage, one Amy often walked. It ended at a small round pond, no more than 11 feet across, shallow, with a layer of mud beneath the water. At first, there was only stillness. Then he saw them, two small bare feet, motionless above the water's surface. The sight hit like a physical blow. He waded in, pulling his daughter's body from the pond. Her face was downward, her hair heavy with water and mud, the back of her head shattered. Nearby, a thick wooden stick jutted from the pond like it had been planted there, its end buried deep in the muck. By the time others reached him, the sound of his cries had already brought half the search party running. The shock spread instantly. It was no accident, no misstep. This was violence, deliberate and brutal. The police were called. The small pond became a crime scene, and the rumors began almost immediately. Who could do such a thing here? Who had been with her last? As darkness fell over Longross, one name was already being whispered more than any other, and with it, the fragile peace of the village began to splinter. By the time Inspector arrived in the early hours of July 19th, the pond at Churchy Common had already been transformed from a quiet corner of the countryside into the center of a murder investigation. The water, once still, was now muddied from the desperate recovery of Amy's body. Around it, footprints pressed deep into the damp earth, some belonging to the rescuers, others perhaps to the killer. The inspector's first focus was the weapon. The thick wooden stick protruding from the pond was pulled free and examined. Heavy, solid, crudely shaped, it could deliver a blow capable of shattering bone. Witnesses would later recall seeing a similar stick in the hands of a local boy earlier that very day. Amy's injuries told a grim story. 3 distinct wounds on her head. One on the crown, one above her right eyebrow, and one at the base of her skull. Each delivered with enough force to penetrate to the bone. And yet, the pond was barely 9 inches deep. Even a child could have stood in it without trouble, which meant the attacker had not only struck her, but left her to drown in water shallow enough for survival, had she been conscious. A home office pathologist later concluded she had been standing in or near the pond when the blows were struck. She fell forward, unconscious or dying, into the muddy water. Whether she took her last breath in that moment or moments later, no one could say for certain. For investigators in 1911, the scene presented both clues and limitations. There were no photographs taken to capture its exact state. Fingerprinting was still a novelty, rarely used outside major cities. DNA analysis was science fiction. The weapon could be compared to others but not linked to a single individual. And yet, even with these constraints, suspicion was forming. Several witnesses had seen a teenage gardener carrying a similar stick that day. His behavior after the murder was odd, nervous, evasive. And most importantly, he had been the last known person to spend time with Amy. But suspicion was not proof. And in an age without modern forensics, suspicion often wasn't enough. The inspector made note of every statement, every scrap of potential evidence, and every inconsistency in the accounts given. The investigation would continue, but even in these early hours, an uncomfortable truth was already taking shape. Without a confession or an eyewitness, justice might be impossible. Still, the suspect's name was beginning to circulate openly now. Neighbors whispered it over fences, exchanged it in low voices on the lanes. And when police finally knocked on his door, the boy who answered didn't yet know it. But his life was about to be consumed by the most notorious murder case this village would ever see. Albert Hampton was 16 years old enough to work full-time, but young enough to still be considered a boy in the eyes of the village. He was a gardener by trade, moving between properties to tend hedges and flower beds. His face was familiar in Longross, so familiar that people barely noticed when he passed. On the morning of July 18th, witnesses saw him in the Reeves yard, chatting and playing with Amy. It wasn't unusual. Hampton had been around before. At that time, nothing in his demeanor raised concern. But later, between 2 o'clock and 2:30 p.m., a neighbor spotted him again, walking up the garden path. This time he seemed different, flustered, restless, like someone trying to speak but unsure of what to say. When questioned casually about where he'd been, Hampton claimed he had been sleeping under an apple tree. It was an odd answer, not impossible but unverifiable. And when investigators later pressed him for more details, his account began to shift. Little changes at first, then contradictions. Multiple residents recalled seeing Hampton carrying a thick wooden stick earlier that day, a stick that matched the murder weapon in size and shape. He had been spotted with it in the morning and again near midday. By the time Amy was found, that stick was in the pond beside her body. The case against him began to take shape. Last known person to be with Amy before she vanished. Seen with an object similar to the murder weapon. Gave an alibi that no one could confirm. Displayed nervous, evasive behavior when questioned. And yet, even with this combination of factors, the investigation faced a major problem. Everything was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, no physical proof linking him to the weapon. In 1911, without a witness or confession, it was a fragile case. Hampton denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with Amy's death. He had no reason, he claimed, to harm her. The absence of a clear motive puzzled investigators and the community alike. Why would a boy she knew turn on her in such a brutal way? The whispers in Longross grew louder, but the evidence in the inspector's hands wasn't getting stronger. Hampton was brought in for further questioning, each session revealing more inconsistencies, but still no hard proof. The villagers began to take sides. Some saw him as a killer who had outwitted the law. Others believed a frightened boy was being cornered by suspicion he didn't deserve. The next step would decide everything. The inquest. And in that small courtroom, the fight for justice would either bring answers or let the truth slip away forever. The inquest into the death of Amy Margaret Reeves drew the entire village of Longross into a single room. Farmers in their work coats, housewives clutching shawls, local children kept close by parents, all crammed into the wooden benches of the courthouse. The air was thick with a mix of grief, outrage, and morbid curiosity. At the center of it all sat Albert Hampton, 16 years old, pale, and staring down at his hands. He looked more like a boy awaiting scolding than a suspect in a child's murder. But the eyes on him were sharp. For many in that room, this was the moment they expected to see justice delivered. The prosecution laid out their case. Hampton had been the last person seen with Amy before she disappeared. Multiple witnesses had seen him carrying a thick wooden stick on the day in question, a stick resembling the one found in the pond beside her body. His movements after midday were suspicious. His alibi was unconfirmed. His behavior erratic. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Amy's mother recounted seeing her daughter and Hampton playing together that morning. Another villager described meeting Hampton around 2 o'clock, noting how agitated he appeared. Several confirmed seeing him with a stick earlier that day. The picture painted was damning, but incomplete. Without fingerprints, without forensic testing, without a confession, the case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. And the defense knew it. They reminded the jury that others in the village had access to sticks like the one found in the pond. They questioned whether nervousness under questioning was proof of guilt. And most pointedly, they asked, where was the motive? Hampton denied any involvement, answering questions with a quiet firmness. He insisted he had been resting under an apple tree and knew nothing of Amy's fate until the news spread through the village. The proceedings stretched over hours, the atmosphere shifting with each new statement. At moments, it seemed the weight of the circumstantial evidence might be enough. At others, it felt like sand slipping through fingers. Finally, the jury withdrew to deliberate. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Every breath held. When they returned, the verdict struck like a cold wind. Amy Margaret Reeves had been willfully murdered, but there was insufficient evidence to determine by whom. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Hampton was released. For some, it was proof the system had failed. For others, it was relief that a possibly innocent boy would not hang on suspicion alone. But for Amy's family, it was something worse, the confirmation that they would leave that room with no justice, and a killer still walking free. And as Hampton stepped out into the summer air, suspicion would follow him like a shadow he could never outrun. The verdict might have been delivered, but the air in Longross did not clear. If anything, it grew heavier. Albert Hampton walked out of the courthouse a free young man. Legally free, at least. The law had released him. The village never would. The whispers began before he had even stepped beyond the front steps. Some swore they saw guilt in his eyes. Others muttered that the jury had been too cautious. A smaller number believed the opposite, that an innocent boy had been hounded by circumstance and rumor. The division cut through friendships, strained family ties, and turned the simple act of greeting a neighbor into an exercise in quiet judgment. Those who believed Hampton guilty avoided his path. Those who defended him bristled at the sideways glances. The village, once tightly knit, began to fray. For Amy's family, the inquest's conclusion was not a relief but a wound left open. The absence of justice was almost as cruel as the loss itself. Each time they stepped outside, they faced the same lanes, the same cottages, the same pond, and somewhere among them, perhaps, the person who had taken Amy's life. Hampton's life did not return to normal. Work was harder to find. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. He carried on as best he could, but the weight of suspicion clung to him. Every glance felt loaded. Every whisper, a verdict. He could not shake the shadow of July 18, 1911. The murder had stolen more than a child's life. It had stolen the sense of safety from an entire community. Parents who once let their children roam the lanes now kept them within sight. Doors that had stayed unlocked for decades began to close and bolt at night. The Reeves case became the unspoken line in the village's history, before Amy and after Amy. Before, when life was simple and trust was unbroken. After, when caution crept into every routine and the idea that evil might be hiding in plain sight was no longer unthinkable. Yet, in the years that followed, no new evidence emerged. No confession surfaced. The story remained unfinished, a wound that time could not heal. And while Hampton's name was the one most often spoken, it was never spoken with certainty. Because if he wasn't the killer, then who was? And that question would echo far beyond Longross, carried forward by the legacy of a case that refused to be forgotten. The killing of Amy Reeves did not fade into the background of local history. It refused to. Her case became a fixture in the collective memory of Longross, and in the years ahead, it would echo far beyond the village boundaries. For law enforcement, the Reeves murder became a grim lesson. The investigation had been thorough for its time, but it was also hamstrung by the limitations of 1911. No photographs were taken to preserve the exact state of the crime scene. Evidence handling was basic, often relying on memory rather than documentation. Fingerprinting was in its infancy, used sparingly, and never applied here. There was no way to scientifically prove that the stick in the pond had ever been in Hampton's hands. Police training began to evolve. Slowly but measurably, the need for preserving crime scenes became a recognized priority. The idea of documenting evidence in detail, of treating every object and every footprint as potentially critical, began to take root. In later decades, these principles would become standard practice, but in 1911, Amy's case was one of the cautionary tales that pushed change forward. It also brought a sharper awareness of the vulnerability of children. Longross had believed itself safe, insulated from the dangers whispered about in city newspapers. Amy's death shattered that illusion. Parents became more protective. Communities became more alert. The very way people thought about child safety began to shift. The press, though limited compared to today, seized on the story. Papers carried accounts of the tragedy and the trial, fanning the debate over the verdict. To some, it was a sign that the justice system was too slow to adapt to a changing world. A world where crimes could be more calculated, more brutal, and harder to prove. For the Reeves family, none of it could bring Amy back. The reforms, the heightened awareness, the newspaper articles, they were footnotes to a loss that was permanent. But their daughter's case had ensured that mistakes made in 1911 would be studied and, hopefully, avoided in the future. Even now, over a century later, true crime historians revisit the file, sifting through the known facts, wondering if a detail was overlooked, if a clue could still be unearthed. They speculate on Hampton's guilt or innocence, on the possibility of another killer entirely. The case remains what it was from the moment the verdict was read. An open wound, an unfinished story. And for those who walk the quiet lanes of Longross today, it remains impossible to forget that one summer afternoon when the village lost its innocence. The case of Amy Margaret Reeves stands as one of the Edwardian era's darkest and most enduring mysteries. A child was taken in the most brutal way imaginable, in a place where harm was unthinkable. The person responsible walked away, whether through cunning, luck, or the failure of a system unprepared for such a crime, and vanished into history without ever facing justice. More than a century has passed since that summer day, yet the details remain as sharp as if they had happened yesterday. The quiet yard, the laughter that drifted across the air, the sudden absence, the shallow pond, and the stick driven into the mud like a cruel signature. We cannot say for certain whether Albert Hampton was guilty, as many believed, or whether the real killer hid in plain sight while suspicion consumed the wrong person. That uncertainty is what gives this case its power. It is a reminder that truth can slip away, even when it seems close enough to grasp. For the Reeves family, there was no comfort, only the knowledge that the one who ended Amy's life had never been held to account. For the village of Longross, the loss of that child marked the end of an era of trust, the moment they learned that evil can wear a familiar face. Today, we have the forensic science, investigative tools, and global communication that could have changed this story entirely. But in 1911, those advances were decades away. All that remained was grief, speculation, and the hope, faint even then, that someday the truth might emerge. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps the truth died with those who knew it. But Amy Reeves's name lives on, not only in the archives of crime history, but in the reminder that justice is never guaranteed, and safety is never absolute, and that, in the end, may be the most haunting truth of all.